It's Richard Mills from Upschool here. For more amazing free lessons like this one, create a free account at upschool.co, and we can't wait to see you on our platform. Welcome everyone. It's just hit 8 o'clock at night in Australia. We've probably got guests from all over the world, which is a wonderful thing. Here with Mark, who hopefully you can see alongside me on the screen. We've got a really amazing event lined up with Dr. Mark Williams here, and it's an honour to have Mark on our show here tonight. Mark and I have had some extensive conversations on the subject of neuroscience, and I definitely come from a place of not too much information on and knowledge on this, but it's fascinating. It's the foundation of learning, in my opinion, and I think there's going to be some amazing takeaways that everyone's going to come away with tonight, whether you're a parent, whether you're a teacher, or whether you're an individual that just wants to learn and enhance your capacity to learn. I think there's going to be some amazing takeaways. So Mark, thank you so much for joining us. You've got a bio here. I'm going to have to read it because it's quite extensive, but Mark, you're an internationally recognised honorary professor of cognitive neuroscience, and you have extensive experience in research and teaching, and you've authored over 80 publications in the subject of neuroscience. So you've worked in some of the top universities in Australia, including MIT, and also in the USA, a global presence in neuroscience. So we're honoured to have you on the program. You've been published in top-tier publications and academic journals, and you've been on the ABC, Sky News, SBS, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Economist, and The New Scientist. So it's definitely an honour to have you here tonight, Mark. It didn't start this way, your life, from what I understand. It didn't look like you were going to be a professor of neuroscience. Tell us a little bit about your backstory.
Yeah, I was actually a truant for most of the time, from probably grade 5, grade 6. I started wagging school. I hated school when I was in, back then it was Form 3, but at Year 9 these days. The principal got my father into the office and told me and him that I'd be dead or in prison by the time I was 25, and so I should get an apprenticeship at the local abattoir. So yeah, no, I wasn't. I was a nightmare. I was one of those kids that teachers just hate to have in the classroom. I was expelled from several schools, and I just didn't learn. I didn't connect with teachers. There's a lot of stuff going on in my life, and there's a lot of violence in the town, and a lot of violence in my life as well, and drugs and so on. So, and mental illness was really the core of all of that. It wasn't until I was 25 that two of my friends actually had drug overdoses, and made me sort of realise that I wanted to do something else. I wanted to change. So I went to TAFE to get my HSC to get into university. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just knew I needed a change, and I needed to get out of the situation I was in, because I didn't want to end up in the same spot as they were. And so, yeah, I went back, and I was really lucky. I met a maths teacher and a physics teacher when I was doing TAFE to get my HSC, and they saw something in me I'd never seen before. They convinced me that I should go to university, that I should do science, and so I did. And yeah, never looked back from there. I ended up with QE2 fellowship and CJ Martin fellowship, and working at MIT in the US, which is the #1 school in the world for neuroscience. So yeah, it was an amazing change, and it really was down to those two teachers who really convinced me that there was something more to me than what I'd seen before that, which is really why now I'm so passionate about getting into schools and working with teachers so that we can really help more people actually do that. And I started on this journey working with schools at Macquarie University, where I started working with a LEAP team, where we go to low socioeconomic areas and work with schools. We go out there for about a week at a time, 3 times a year, and work with schools that are struggling, and trying to convince the students that there are other options out there, which is why I go. and also working with the teachers on how to connect and how to get more out of their students. So a lot of these schools are locked schools. A lot of them have a lot of gang problems, race issues, and so on. So that's been extremely rewarding, but tough at the same time, because of course there are situations that happen in those schools that, yeah, we won't talk about now. But yeah, that's a little bit of my journey, and that's why I ended up taking redundancy from Macquarie University and started in my own business, where I'm now working with schools and trying to bring neuroscience into schools and into businesses, because there's a lot of discoveries over the last 20 years or so, and we really need to get that into schools and into businesses, so that we can be all, more brain aware and healthier overall with, both productivity and learning.
I think your story is inspiring, because it obviously it offers hope to anyone who is maybe their life is not exactly where they want it to be, or maybe they know someone, they have loved ones or children or nieces or nephews or neighbours that their life is not where it should be, and you've been able to turn it around, and you must have surprised some people along the way when you turned the ship.
Yeah, I think I did. Yeah, it was. I mean, it's always a process, right? It always takes a long time. And you hear about these people that are overnight successes, but then when you actually look at it, it actually takes a long time to get to that point. And so, I had lots of bumps along the way. It wasn't just turned around and went to TAFE, and then all of a sudden, life was great. I spent a lot of time in therapy, working with psychologists. Some I got along with, some didn't work out so well. I spent a lot of time, struggling with who I was and all those sorts of things as well. So it wasn't a complete change, but then, yeah, it has made a big difference in my life. I mean, I live a very different life now than what I was living back then, which is fantastic. And, my kids are very fortunate for that.
You've clearly going to have a really broad perspective of the human condition, given you have obviously experienced so much yourself, and really at both ends of a spectrum, you could say. You must have amazing insights into the brain, and maybe this is a good time to link into the topic of our conversation tonight. And I'd like to know, what do we know about the brain to this point in time with how far science has got us? Like, what do we know about the brain? Maybe we can start defining some terms. What is neuroscience? What is the brain? What is the function of the brain? What is the function of neuroscience? It's a big topic, but let's drop a pin there.
Yeah, so neuroscience is really just the study of the brain. So neuro is just brain, and then the science is studying that. And neuroscience, up until about 25 years ago, neuroscience was really dedicated to looking at animal models. So looking at rats and monkeys and all these other animal models, which was very different to the human brain, to be honest. And so it wasn't until about 25 years ago that this new discipline came along, which is cognitive neuroscience, which is basically just looking at the human brain rather than looking at monkey brain or other brains. And so I'm really specialised in cognitive neuroscience, so I look at the human brain rather than other brains. But I do have experience in other areas as well. And because of that, in the last 25 years, there's been some really major changes in the way we see the human brain and the way the human brain actually works. And one of the really important things, of course, is neuroplasticity, which you probably heard the term, gets thrown around a lot these days. But neuroplasticity just means that the brain is constantly changing. And we know that the brain is constantly changing. So we used to think that you were born with too many connections, and then they got pruned back. And once they were pruned back, you were pretty well stuck where you were, so nothing really changed. Now we know that the brain constantly changes throughout our lives until we actually die. And that's a good thing, but it's also a bad thing, because if you're not using your brain, then things actually atrophy, right? So it's plastic in both ways, and I think people really need to realise that you've actually got to keep using it. You've got to keep exercising it, just like any muscle. And if you don't keep exercising it, then it is going to atrophy. But it's also awesome because it means it does change constantly throughout our lives, and it means that it's really one thing that really frustrates me in a lot of education settings is pigeonholing kids because of their current ability because we know it can change, right? IQ is a really poor measure of how intelligent or where the success of an individual, but it pigeonholes people because someone says, "Oh, you've got an average IQ," the child then thinks, "Oh, that's therefore I can't become, a neuroscientist," and it's like, well, you can. Because if you work that brain, then it will get better and it will change. And we know that the brain changes dramatically over lifespan. So even during the teenage years, a person's IQ can change from what we call 15 basis points, which is basically going from an average individual or IQ to a high IQ, somebody who could become a neuroscientist or whatever they want to be. And that happens just in that teenage years. So you can imagine how much it changes from the day they start school to the day they finish school. I mean, there's huge change that can happen there, but it can happen in both ways. So we need to be really careful that we're actually exercising in the right way. So that's one of the really big changes. And I can tell you, you want to ask a question there.
I have a question. So what does this look like? So I hear this exercising the brain. Like, I mean, I can imagine what it might be, but what would be sort of the minimum requirements to be qualifying as exercising your brain on a daily basis? And is it on a daily basis? Is it multiple times a day? Is it once a week? Like any exercise regime, the people that that are in the business of handing out exercise regimes have certain parameters that you should adhere to. So if you want to maintain or keep your fitness, you need to be exercising 2 or 3 times a week for maybe an hour a day, or maybe it's half hour a day for 7 days a week. Like, what does it actually look like practically speaking? Like, what would you offer our audience as a practical takeaway of what the exercise actually looks like?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on what the reasoning for it is. If you want to actually become better at something, then obviously you're going to spend more time on that thing, and therefore, that regiment's going to be different to if you're just trying to maintain an ability. But to exercise the brain overall, the number one thing, the thing that exercises the brain better than anything else, like the big takeaway, is a socialization. So actually sitting down with someone face to face and having a conversation activates more of the brain, gets more of the brain working than anything else you can do. So actually just sitting down with someone face to face, not over Zoom, because Zoom actually, there's lots of issues with the way we actually interact over devices, but face to face with someone, actually have a real conversation with someone, that activates more of the brain than anything else we actually do. And that's what we should be doing the most. That's what's really important for us, because we are the social species and we've grown up or evolved in an environment where we're communicating with each other constantly, right? We're in these small groups originally, and we were communicating with each other and we were socializing. And that was how we survived, is to actually socialize with each other. So that's the thing that actually activates the brain more than anything else. So if you want to have a really strong brain, that's what you should be doing, which is, of course, why in nursing homes, they'll organize things where they all get together and have sing-alongs, or they'll organize things where they do exercise together, or they'll take them out on buses and so on. Because we know that actually does activate more of the brain than anything else. And it actually decreases the likelihood of these people getting Alzheimer's and other neurodegenerative diseases. But even with us, that is the number one thing. And so that's what we need to really focus on. And that's the thing that really worries me with this generation, the kids today, is that they're not socializing anywhere near the extent that we need to be socializing face to face with people. And so therefore they're not exercising those really important aspects of their brain, and they're not keeping it fit. They're not keeping their brains fit or developing those abilities that they really need for the 21st century. Because I mean, all of the 21st century skills are centered around being able to communicate, being able to collaborate, being able to be a leader and so on. Those things are determined by how well you're actually able to connect to people, how you're able to communicate with people.
Does it change across age? Is it the same basic exercise regime if you're 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age, or if you're 90 years of age, you need more or less at a certain age, or a different type of stimulation or socialization at different ages?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it doesn't. That's a yes and a no answer. So the younger the child, the more stressed they're going to be in social situations. So they need to learn how to cope with those social situations, and they need to develop those abilities. So at that age, in the really early ages, they're actually still developing those abilities to actually collaborate with people and to work with people and play with people. And that's why play is so important in those first 10, 15, probably 20 years, although we should all be playing whenever we can. But that play is really important for actually learning how to actually collaborate. So in those early years, they're actually developing those abilities, whereas later on what we're doing is maintaining those abilities. So you don't probably need as much when you get older, but you still need to be able to do that to maintain it. But you've already developed it. You can imagine, a weightlifter, once they get to a certain strength and muscle tone and all the rest of it, they don't need to be working out as much to maintain that muscle strength and all the rest of it. Yeah.
Sure. Why is it that you alluded to the fact that a Zoom conversation is not going to stimulate as much that human connection? And I think the reason I ask that is, I mean, when I observe young people, especially teenagers, and not even teenagers, like all of us, like we've all got, one of these devices sitting beside us, and when I observe the human condition, and I look at the way that we've evolved in the short period of time I've been alive in, obviously I haven't been around that long, so I've only seen my generation, but the device really is still pointing to human connection in so many ways. Like all these social media apps, like if you keep breaking everything down, ultimately we want to connect and we want to fit in with the pack.
Yeah.
And it seems to be a tool that enables us to do that. But we still are able to connect through the device. Why is it something that's that you say is not fulfilling the need that it should?
Yeah, when you're on a screen and looking at someone or checking out their posts or whatever you're doing, you don't get all of the extra neurotransmitters that we need. So there's three main neurotransmitters that are released when you're actually face to face with someone, and that's dopamine, which is sort of a happy hormone. There's serotonin, which is joy. It's more than just happy. It's actually this sense of joy and then there's oxytocin, which helps us to actually connect with people. It opens us up and makes us more willing to actually be part of someone's group, if you like. And all of those things are released when you're face to face with someone. And the reason for that is multiple. One is you can smell them. And so we have pheromones that actually are activated by the smell of someone else, and they release the serotonin and the oxytocin. There's also touch. So we as humans have C fibers on our skin, and it's on our hairy skin, which is most of our skin except for our palms and our feet. And those C fibers activate areas in our brain that then release oxytocin and serotonin. So just touching, and that's why in all societies we have some form of touching when we actually greet someone. So in the more stoic societies like ours, we shake hands, which results in the release of those pheromones. In other countries, they'll kiss each other. But I mean, even Inuits will rub noses because it's only part of their body that's actually showing where they can actually touch, right? They don't shake hands because they've got gloves on and they can't take the gloves off. And that's so that you get the release of the serotonin and oxytocin so that you connect better when you're actually face to face, when you're actually with someone. We don't get any of that when we're actually on a screen because you've got no touching, you've got none of the pheromones. So all you get is the dopamine. And I like to think of it a bit like having a going to McDonald's versus having a home cooked meal. If you're on a screen, you're going to get a little hit of dopamine, which is going to make you feel good, but you're not going to get the extra serotonin and oxytocin, which is actually going to create a connection between you and that other person and have a real conversation with them. So you miss out on all that extra stuff. So you're having the McDonald's, but you're not going to feel very fulfilled. You're going to have a little bit of joy and then you're not going to feel fulfilled. Whereas if you are face to face with someone, you're going to get all those extra neurotransmitters, and it's going to be more like having a home cooked meal where you're going to be full and you're going to feel really relaxed and a glass of wine and all the rest of it, right? And so we need to actually have that face-to-face rather than the on-screen. And I prefer we didn't call them social media apps. I prefer that we call them connection apps, where we actually get on them and organise to meet someone and then go and meet them in real life. I think they're a great tool for doing that. but they're not a great tool for actually satisfying our need to connect with people, because you're not really connecting. What you're doing is viewing someone else's life. Well, it's not even their life, right? You're viewing an edited version of their life, yeah, which is going to make you feel bad because it looks better than your real life, because all of our lives don't look like that. And you're not actually really connecting. You're not getting all those extra neurotransmitters that you need.
Sure. Let's change direction a little bit and bring it to the classroom or the home, in a learning environment, the classroom or a home. And obviously we've got some teachers in here, and we've got some parents in here, and probably got some other people who are just curious about neuroscience in general and this topic of learning. You work in schools a lot. You have a, I don't know whether you can hear, there's a lot of rain on my roof. I don't know whether that's coming through.
I'm not hearing it.
It might sound like I'm under a waterfall, but if Melbourne, turning on the weather for this show, the classroom and the subject of learning. So you work in schools a lot, Mark, and you have a really amazing insight because of the work that you do into a classroom setup and learning environments. From everything that you see, like if you cast a big blanket over everything that you see, where are the big opportunities to rethink about the way that we interact with our children, that we teach our children, and the big opportunities to enhance their learning?
Yeah, so there's a few things, and number one is connection. You can't learn from someone you're not connected with. So we really need connection with the teacher and with the environment that you're actually in, and that comes from, again, from an evolutionary perspective. We learn really well, so we all learn extremely quickly, and we actually learn based on one trial, which is quite amazing and something that computers can't do. But because of that, we've also got this really neat mechanism, which is that we don't learn from people we don't trust. Sure. Or we're not connected to. So, and it's because of that group thing, right? We used to be part of tribes, and so we wanted to learn from people who were in our tribe, but we didn't want to learn from people who weren't in our tribe because they might be teaching us the wrong thing. So we've got this mechanism in our brain which actually shuts off any learning that's going to happen from someone who we don't feel as though they're part of our tribe. So you've got to have everybody in your classroom has to feel as though they're part of your tribe, part of your group. And if they don't, then they're not going to learn from you. And we now know that they actually hear what you're saying differently. So I did some great research. I'll say it's great because I thought it was, but showing that if you don't feel as though you're part of the group, you actually see the person or the people in the group differently than if you do feel as though you're part of the group. So you see them as less attractive if you're not part of the group. You actually don't like them. You see their facial expressions differently. So you see a smile actually as an angry face. So if a student doesn't feel as though they're part of the group, then when the teacher smiles, they're actually seeing that as an angry face, So they're not actually going to be learning from that person. And they actually don't hear what they're saying. So you actually hear things differently depending on whether you're part of the group or you're not part of the group. And so they really need to become connected. They really need to become part of your group, and you need to work on that, which is why I do a lot of work with teachers on how to actually connect with students. But the other big thing is error feedback. One thing we do, I think, poorly in schools is that we focus on kids getting things right. So teacher stands up in front of the class and asks a question, and a bunch of kids put up their hands, and they ask one of the kids what the answer is, and the kid gets it right. And they go, yeah, great, that was awesome. The problem is you don't learn anything if you're right? So if you're correct, you're not learning anything because you already knew it, yeah? So we actually learn by error feedback. We learn by actually getting things wrong. So the way a baby, for example, will learn is they see their carer will say, they'll point to a dog and they'll say dog. And so the baby automatically comes up with a hypothesis that that thing there is either the item dog, that's name, or there's a whole category of those things that are called dogs. Yeah. And then the next time they see a dog, another dog, and the carer says dog, they then get rid of the first one, which is an item, and they realize it's a category. Yeah. And so they go, oh, that's a dog, and they've learned it, and that's it. And now they know the category of dogs, which is quite amazing because computers, you take thousands and thousands of trials to do the same thing. But that's based on the error, right? They got the error that it's not an item, it's a thing. What we focus too much on is getting it right. So your students put up their hands. The problem is that if you ask a student what the answer is, the other kids who don't like that student, yeah, because they're Hermione Granger and nobody likes them who's in the classroom because they're always getting everything right, they all turn off because they're not part of the group. And they're the kids who probably would have got it wrong, but they don't hear what's actually being said because we know that you don't listen to people who aren't part of your in-group. So all the kids who could have actually learnt then don't learn anything. And the person who actually already knew it and therefore wasn't going to learn anything anyway doesn't learn anything either. So you've got to get rid of that way of actually teaching. What you need to do is just ask the question. And when you ask a question, when you say to someone, what colour are flamingos, you automatically think of the answer, right? And if you don't know the answer, you automatically go, oh, I don't know the answer to that. And then the teacher can give the answer. And all the kids who didn't know the answer will have actually just learned something. And the kids who already knew the answer weren't going to learn anything anyway because they already knew the answer. So we've got to, rethink that we don't want to actually isolate those kids who actually know the answer because, they're not learning anything. But also we really don't want to be isolating those kids who don't actually feel as though they're part of the group or part of those other kids. The other thing is in testing. So I talk about either testing to teach or teaching to test or testing to remember. And what we tend to do in a lot of schools is we test, we teach to test. So we say, all right, we're going to do this subject, and then when we finish this subject, we're going to test all the students. Now we know that if you test all the students at the end of teaching them a subject, the next day they forget the majority of that information that they actually knew when they did the test. And the reason for that is we know now that memory isn't actually there for us to remember the past. Our memory that is actually there for us to act in the future. And so our memory system is set up in that way. And during the night time when we're sleeping, our brain goes through all of our memory systems and gets rid of the stuff that we won't need anymore because it wants to update and rejig it all. And so if you run a test at the end of the subject and the students think, oh, this is all over, then they're going to get rid of all those memories. What we should be doing is testing at the beginning. So if you test the students at the beginning, then they're not going to know most of the answers. But A, you don't give them feedback on that because they don't need feedback. But B, you now know what the students know and what the students don't know. So you can focus on that stuff that they don't know because error feedback, you need to be going on over the stuff that they don't know. But also the students know what they're going to learn and what they don't know yet. Because again, you automatically know when you're doing a test which questions you're struggling with and which questions you really know well. And so if you give the test first, they already know, oh, this is the stuff I'm not really confident on. So when it comes up in the class, they'll concentrate on it more because they already know what they're actually not confident on. And that way they'll actually learn more from the actual process. And there's a lot of research showing that's the best time to actually test the child is before they're actually taught any of the subject, because then you can actually go through that process. And then the third way is testing intermittently during the teaching process, because we know that based on a lot of the memory research that as soon as you learn something, you start forgetting it pretty much straight away and you forget it all over a couple of days. And what you want to do is retest them during that period. The problem is that if you retest them and you ask them a question that they knew the answer to, they continue to forget it at the same rate. So if they actually get the question right, they continue to forget it at the same rate. If they get it wrong and they're corrected, then they actually remember it better. So you've got to get them when they've actually forgot what they're actually supposed to remember and then test them on that, which you can do. There's lots of nice little tricks that you can do to actually do that. And you can also teach students how to actually do that themselves with flashcards and things like that. But it's really important that we keep testing them at intermittent periods, but they're only going to remember the stuff that they get wrong. They're not going to remember better the stuff that they get right. So it's really important to really focus on what they're getting wrong, not what they're getting right. But of course, that means that you've actually got to be connected to them, because most kids don't like being wrong, because we've all been trained that we want to be right? And what we actually want to do is be wrong, because that's when innovation and creativity and all these things happen. When we start being wrong, we actually come up with new ways of doing things and we learn better.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Sorry, yeah.
No, that's it's all really fascinating. I've got a couple of questions. If we round back to the start, when you're talking about the pack and the building of the trust, and then I'll work my way back through the areas that I'd like to expand on a little bit for my own peace of mind, so I can move on with some more information. The belonging in the pack and the building of the trust. How do we establish whether we've got the trust of the children in our care? Like, is it just an intuitive thing that we observe and we feel as though they're part of the group? And how do we, a teacher's got 25 or 30 children in his or her class, and could potentially be difficult to monitor all of them to see whether they feel as though they're part of the pack. Because I think what you said is, if they don't feel as though they're part of the pack, they're not going to learn. If they don't have the trust of the teacher, they're not going to learn. Obviously, building trust, I mean, that's probably a very human thing that is probably an opening of the heart and a really welcoming in. And I'm sure all of those things that we're probably familiar with. But is there a way you can assess this?
Yeah, I think most teachers I work with know who the students are that are part of their group. They probably haven't thought about it like that before, but they know who the students are who are into their class and the students who don't want to be there. You do get a feeling for that fairly. I think most teachers get a feeling for that really intuitively in their class, and can probably reel off 4, 5, 6, however many students in their class who aren't part of their group, who aren't, and behavioural issues, of course, is one way of knowing that it's happening. That's at the extreme end. But just, not being interested, not putting up their hand, having their head down, talking when they're, supposed to be working, and those sorts of things. I think most teachers are pretty intuitive about that.
Sure.
But I'll give you an example. I went to a school when I was going with Leap. We went to a particular school. It was a primary school, and they were working on getting above 50% attendance at the schools. They were around about 40% attendance on any particular day. So they had a lot of truancy at the school. And there was one teacher who actually had 90% attendance in his class, which was amazing. It was a year 3 class. And so, I always want to observe these teachers because they're the ones I learn from. And when the bell rang in the morning, what he did, he went out the front, he got down on one knee, and so he was eyeballing the kids at their level. And he had a different handshake for every child as they came to his classroom, and they all did the handshake. But he looked into their eyes and he said, how was last night? How are you feeling today? And what are we going to learn? Yeah. And so he connected with each of them, and he knew them all really, really well. And I think that's the thing that we've got to do. We've actually got to really connect with these kids. We've got to get down their level, and we've got to connect with them so they feel as though we actually care about them. We actually do want to be part of their tribe, and we want them to be part of our tribe, and that they can all learn, and we're there to give them that opportunity to learn. And he had, I actually did neuroimaging with them. I put electrodes on a lot of their heads and stuff, and the kids were just so well behaved. I mean, these kids from really messed up backgrounds. I won't go into some of the situations, but it's normally they would be a nightmare. But I was able to, put electrodes on their heads and record their brains and do all these things with them. And they were fascinated, and they were really interested in it. But again, the teacher was there asking questions, and the teacher was there and willing to show that he didn't understand as well, right? He was able to get down with kids and have a great time with me, putting electrodes on and getting, stuff with gel in their hair and all the rest of it, and ask questions as though he didn't know what he was talking about either. And that willingness, I think, too, is, being vulnerable in front of the kids is really important as well. But you really need to connect with them. But sorry, I went on. But yeah, I think we do know when we don't connect with someone. I think everybody knows, right? As soon as you've got friends that, you've just fallen out with or whatever, it's pretty obvious.
Yeah, cool. The error feedback. So I've done a little bit of reading across the weekend and listening to Andrew Huberman talk about neuroscience, and he suggested a percentage, and I just wanted to get your feedback on it, like the percentage of the work that's challenging and the work that the work they're able to achieve, or the questions they're able to answer successfully, as opposed to the ones that they get wrong. Very rudimentary. He said like an 85%, a 15% ratio, like 85% right, 50% wrong. Have you got any thoughts on like how we should sort of like what is the the percentage of like where we actually pitch the optimal state of learning so that we're challenging the students and keeping them engaged?
Yeah, I mean that's his work goes to this idea that you need to market and give it back to them. Whereas I don't agree. Well, it's not that I don't agree, but in that scenario, you do need to keep it at a fairly high rate that they're getting it right. But all of that time that you're spending on them getting it right is actually not benefiting them, and they're not actually learning anything. Whereas to me, standing in front of the class, doesn't matter what age group you're looking at, and just giving them the questions, saying the questions, getting them to think, and then giving them the answer without actually requiring them to write it down and you mark it and give it back to them and make them feel bad about themselves, right? Is a better way to do it, because they're not feeling bad about it, and it doesn't really matter the percentage that they're getting right or wrong, because they're not going to know that, because you're just reeling off questions and they're thinking about it and getting it right or wrong and then learning from that. And so therefore you don't have to worry about these percentages. If you're giving them a test and then giving them feedback, you do want to make sure that they're getting a percentage right, or else they're going to hate you, right? Because it's going to be a struggle. But if you're just doing it as in class, what color are apples, you give them the question and then give them the answer, then you don't have to worry about the percentages, and therefore you can drop that right down so that they're actually learning a lot during your class rather than having to think. I mean, I know, and I always get a lot of a response here from teachers, so I'll bring it up, that they need to have marks and so on to give feedback to parents, and the curriculum requires that they mark and all the rest of it. And yes, that's true, but I think we need to minimize that, and I think teachers as professionals need to push back on that. I think we really need to say, hey, we want to teach the kids, we don't want to just pigeonhole them, right? And marking and giving them feedback on you're this here and is just crap, because they're not, right? That's just a result from one test, and they probably know stuff that they don't know. And testing relies on not just what you know, but also your anxiety levels, so personality issues, what happened that morning, did you have a fight with your mum before you got to school? Lots of things can affect test results, and I think it's really sad that we put so much emphasis on test results and on giving kids marks and all these sorts of things when we don't actually need to, for them to actually learn. And school should be about learning.
Sure. I want to change direction just a little bit, and I want to talk about neuroplasticity a little bit, because I think this absolutely relates to learning. Can you tell us, like, just redefine what neuroplasticity is? And I'd like to explore the evolution of neuroplasticity in terms of like the different milestone or age groups that we are most neuroplastic, if that's a word. Maybe malleable is a better word. Is there certain ages where we are able to be, I guess, rewire ourselves in terms of our, in terms of our ability to be affected by neuroplasticity? And I also want to talk about sleep as well, and the importance of sleep.
Oh yeah.
Neuroplasticity.
Yeah, no, sleep's really important. So neuroplasticity is learning, right? And neuroplasticity is just how our brains change themselves to learn, whether it happens to be a motor response or a visual response or memory or whatever, right? So we're actually just learning, and that's what neuroplasticity is. And what I'd like to stop calling teachers and start calling them neuroplasticians, because they are neuroplasticians, right? They're actually changing kids' brains, and that actually changes the way they perceive the world. And so it's really, really an important aspect of it, which we haven't talked about, but predictive coding is something that we've learned in the last 20 years, which is basically the idea that we don't see the world as it actually is, but we see it based on our memories. So we actually change what kids perceive when they actually learn. So when you learn something new, you perceive the world differently because of that. So you're actually changing teachers are actually changing the way kids and students see the world, which is amazing, right? But we'll get back to the plasticity. So we used to think that there was these critical periods, that you had these critical periods that you had to learn certain things, and if you didn't learn them within those critical periods, then you were lost and you'd never be able to develop that ability. That's nonsense. We now know that there aren't any critical periods. Sorry, I'll clarify that. There are critical periods for very low level perceptual aspects of our brain. So the way our lateral geniculate nucleus forms, which is like just after our retina, there's fibers that go into our LGN, the way that forms in little rows, and then the way the V1 forms into striate cortex, which is just basically striped, all of that does have critical periods for it. And also our auditory cortex, primary auditory cortex, that has critical periods associated with it, which is why we try to do interventions for hearing and stuff as early as we possibly can so that they don't miss those critical periods. But once you get past that really early perceptual stuff, there aren't any critical periods. You can learn a language to a level of a native speaker into your 80s and 90s, right? And so we used to think that you had to learn or at least hear a native speaker of a language by the time you're about 9 or 10, or else you could never become a native speaker. We now know that's not true, and people have taught 70-year-olds and 80-year-olds how to do that. So there aren't these critical periods. Neuroplasticity occurs throughout the whole period, unless you have some sort of disease. So if you have a neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's or dementia or Parkinson's, then it's not, you don't have that ability anymore because of the disease, and you're actually atrophying. Or if you have a learning disability, then it can also hamper your ability to change certain aspects of your brain. But outside of that, yeah, it's plastic throughout your life, and you can become whatever you want to become whenever you want to become it, as long as you're willing to put in the time and the effort. Yeah, so we all have the ability to become whatever we want to become, as I proved, right? I learned how to read by reading surfing magazines. I didn't go to school, and I was a surfer, so I did learn how to reading surfing magazines, but that was my interest. But yeah, I mean, I didn't go to school really until I was 25.
Tell me about sleep, Mark. I don't think I get enough of it personally.
Nobody does.
I am guilty of sometimes only sleeping 3 to 4 hours a night, and that's not every night, but sometimes I'm sitting up at a computer all night, and for anyone in this room who have children, I'm sure they're sitting there on their devices up until later, or watching TV, and there's these bright lights and everything's kind of hypersensory these days. No doubt it affects our sleep, that we've got phones on our way to bed and even in bed, and I don't think anyone's completely immune to it. I mean, congratulations to the person in this audience who is able to master their phone, their cell phone, and even that of their children. Tell us about the importance of sleep and the importance of, or I'm not putting words in your mouth, but how we work with our devices around sleep time when it's coming up to sleep time. And I want to link that into learning, because from what I understand, a lot of our learning takes place when we're sleeping. The neuroplasticity takes place when we're sleeping. So quality sleep is essential to learning, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll do those in reverse order. So I'll start with the learning. You don't learn during the day, you learn when you're sleeping. So we don't learn anything during the day. What happens during the day is we attend to what we're actually doing, whatever it happens to be that we're doing. If we attend to it for long enough, it gets transferred to this temporary store. And then at night, it gets transferred to your long-term memory when you're sleeping. So if you don't get enough sleep, then all that information doesn't get transferred, so you lose it. So yeah, learning really only happens at night when we're actually sleeping. So sleeping is critical for learning, because if you don't sleep during the night, then you don't transfer anything to long-term memory. So everything you learnt that day is gone. It hasn't been transferred to your long-term memory. During sleep, what happens is there's 5 stages. and we go through all those 5 stages every hour or so. In the first 4 or 5 hours of sleep, our brains focus more on the first 4 stages, and it only spends a little bit of time in the 5th stage. The first 4 stages are really all about getting rid of all the neurotoxins that are in your brain so that your brain's healthier, and also going through your memory system and all the other systems to sort of do in computer terms, defrag, right? You're going through and you're fixing things up and moving things that could, and consolidating things and doing all those sorts of stuff in your brain. And then the last one, the REM sleep, is when you're actually laying down your memories. And you do it in reverse. The laying down of the memories, which is really interesting, you do it in reverse order. So you lay down memories in the first hour based on what you just did before you go to sleep. And you do it in reverse order. So the stuff you did just before you went to sleep is the stuff that actually gets laid down first. And then each hour we go back a little bit in the trace, which is why we talk about at least needing 8 hours of sleep, because it's in the last 6, 7, 8 hours that you spend a lot more time in that REM sleep. And so that's when you lay down most of your memories from the day. If you're only sleeping 4 or 5 hours, then you're not getting to that stage where you actually spend a lot of time in that REM sleep, where you're actually laying down all of those memories from the whole day, and especially the stuff earlier in the day. The other really cool thing about sleep is during sleep is when we actually do a lot of our learning as well. And a lot of our teenagers do most of their social learning during the sleep time. Because what we do during sleep in that REM time is we run through scenarios of what happened that day when we're actually laying down the memories. So you can imagine a teenager, they think, they have a dream of, I walked into the school and I saw my friend and they didn't talk to me, so I didn't talk to them, and then we had a fight later on the day, and da-da-da-da-da. And then they go, I walked into school and my friend didn't talk to me, so I yelled out and said, hey, what happened, da-da. And then they say, oh, something else. And then it was okay and this happened. Or I walked into school and when I saw my friend, I yelled at them and we had a fight. And you go through hundreds and hundreds of different scenarios that could have happened during the day based on just little snippets of what happened during the day. And that's, as I said, when teenagers and people learn how to actually have relationships with people, which is why it's so important for teenagers to have that sleep. But it's also when we actually put things together and come up with innovative ideas and creative ideas. So if you read any stuff on like Einstein or any of these amazing guys, they all talk about the fact that they dreamt their amazing hypotheses. And it's because during that period of sleep, what we're doing is coming up with all these different hypotheses. So if you want to be innovative and creative, it's actually sleep that you need. So what you want to do if you're in a business or whatever and you want to come up with new ideas, what you want to do is send out all the new ideas to people and then let them sleep on it for a couple of days and then bring them in. Yeah. So actually brainstorming, going, all right, let's brainstorm this, is really unproductive. It's a really bad way to do it. What you want to do is give them the stuff, let them go away, and then let them come back a few days later, because they will have, during their sleep, gone through hundreds of different scenarios as to how that stuff can actually work. But yeah, that's how sleep works. And that's why it's so important for us to have adults at least 8 hours, teenagers at least 10 hours sleep.
And what about younger than teenagers?
Yeah, it depends on the age, but anywhere from 12 through to 10 hours is really important. And the more of that, the better. And we know that, right? Schools that start later actually end up getting better results, right? Because the kids are actually able to sleep longer,
right?
So they end up with better results as a result of actually just starting the school day a bit later. In the US, they used to start quite early, and a lot of schools have now rolled it back, and they've seen 20-25% increase in learning. Didn't do anything else, but just started school a bit later.
My brain doesn't turn on before 9 o'clock, I have to say. So it makes perfect sense to me. Hey, what are some of the big impacts on quality sleep for our children? How do we give them? How do we lay a platform for them to get the best quality sleep possible, so they can do all of this learning that you're talking about?
Yeah, number one is get them off the devices. The problem with devices is that it's exciting, right? They're designed to be exciting because they're designed to get us addicted to them. So you've got to get them off the devices at least an hour before you want them to actually go to sleep. get them to read. Number one thing, if you want your child to be successful, number one thing is to get them to read. Reading is so important. Even in schools, the first thing I say to any executive group that I speak to is just get your students to spend half an hour every morning before they do anything else reading, and you will increase your outcomes. Within 6 to 12 months, because reading is critical for any job that you actually want, and reading is critical for any subject that you actually want to learn, because you've got to actually be able to read. As a neuroscientist who I used to have 1,000 students in my courses, and the ones that did really well were the ones that were able to read the textbook and read it well and read it quickly, right? Because it's a big textbook and they've got to get through it. So you want to be good at neuroscience, you got to be good at reading. Nothing else. I don't care about anything else. If you're good at reading, then you're going to be very successful at it, or successful at anything else. So, I would say get them off the devices at least an hour before they go to bed, and then get them to read a book, the old-fashioned book. Get them to read something like that. Journaling is also really good. If you've got a child that is anxious or is stressed or is having issues, getting them just to write down issues that they're having, gets it out of their brain and gets it onto the paper, and so that they can actually sleep. So I always have, journals. I have stacks of journals that I'm constantly writing in. But yeah, getting them to journal regularly is also very helpful, because that'll actually relax them. But those are the two things that I would suggest. Get them reading a book, which is extremely good for them, and get them to journal if they're having stress or anxiety around things, which is also very beneficial.
I think one of the biggest obstacles to humanity now is, in a professional sense, is focus.
Yeah.
And our inability to focus. Like, we live in a world where everyone wants a piece of us. Everything is geared towards capturing our attention, and the first thing I'd like to know is what's happening on a cellular level or on a chemical level when someone captures our attention and we actually give it. Like, what is happening inside of our body that wants us to give attention to one thing? That's the first thing I'd like to touch on. And the second thing is, how do we increase our focus as adults and even as children? Is it the same thing? So that's probably a two-part question.
Yeah. So the second part's easy. It's exactly the same for adults and for children. It's more detrimental in kids because they don't have a fully functioning prefrontal cortex. So the prefrontal cortex, which is what controls our attention, it's not actually fully functional until we're about 25 years of age, so 25 plus or minus 2 years. So in kids, it's going to be much worse. And also, they've got to develop the ability to attend to things, right? And if they're not ever attending things, they're never going to develop that ability to attend to things. But attention is critical for our ability to learn. But we know that the younger a child is given a device to use, either an iPad or a phone or any of those devices, the more likely they are to be diagnosed with ADHD. So the younger they're given a device, the more likely they're to be diagnosed with ADHD. The more time they spend on a device, the more likely they are to have ADHD symptoms or autism-like symptoms, which is really, really something we need to think about, especially here in Australia, because in Australia we have more devices in schools than most countries in the world. We used to be number one. We're around 3 or 4 now, but we are, extreme. We have huge numbers of devices. Kids are on devices way more than they need to be in schools, especially given that we now know that coding isn't a job that's going to be around in the future. So I'm not sure why they're spending so much time on devices. But the reason we are attracted to these devices is that they're designed to be addictive. So addiction and addiction happens because you get a cue which you respond to, yeah, and that causes the cue causes behavior, which is responding to whatever it is. And then you get a dopamine release because you get some sort of benefit from it. You get some sort of joy from it. So, we get a buzz on the phone, we check our phone. It happens to be someone who loves us and says something nice to us. Or it happens to be, a friend a funny Facebook page or a funny, whatever it happens to be. And that dopamine then activates our memory centers so that we remember that better. So remember that cue caused that behavior, which gave us a nice response. And that's a normal mechanism, which is actually designed so that we'll do things that are good for us, right?
Oh.
It actually works for food and for having sex and for doing these things that are actually, from an evolutionary point of view, really good. But the devices and stuff, the Facebook and that have admitted that they use that feedback loop to actually get us addicted to the phones. And that's why we're addicted to it and why we so quickly will attend to the whatever happens to beep or buzz or whatever else that's actually happened. It's really easy to solve. All you've got to do is turn off all your notifications.
I am all ears now.
So if you turn off all your notifications on your phone and you turn off all your notifications on your devices that you've got, and you just schedule into your day times that you're going to check your email and times that you're going to check LinkedIn and times that you're going to check Facebook, then you don't have that cue that's actually causing that disruption. So all you got to do is turn off all your notifications and you won't actually have that cue that causes that behavior, which causes dopamine response, which gets you to do it over and over and over again. So turning off your notifications is number one. And it's the simplest way to do it. And then, yeah, tell your friends and everybody else that if they really need you, call you. And they do, right? I have all my notifications, including my messenger, turned off, the notifications, and I check it when I want to. And I had an emergency a couple of weeks ago. My daughter had an asthma attack at school. The school didn't Facebook me, right? The school called me, right? And my phone does ring because it's a phone and I want it to ring. So if there's an emergency, I'll get a phone call. And if it's not an emergency, then I'll check it when I'm ready to check it. And actually, if you do it that way, it actually decreases mental health issues. It decreases stress, it decreases the likelihood of you having depression, decreases the likelihood of suicidal tendencies. So it's extremely beneficial. And they've shown that some companies will now batch their emails to their employees. So they'll only get a batch of emails 2 or 3 times a day, and all the employees know when that's going to happen. So that's when they'll check their emails so they're not getting constantly distracted by it. In Germany, a whole bunch of companies now have made it well, the workers and the leaders and managers and so on are not allowed to email the employees after 6 o'clock or before 8 o'clock in the morning. So and they'll actually get a fine if they do that, because we know how bad it is for our attention, but also productivity, innovation, and our mental health, our well-being is being affected by this. So, and that's the easiest way to get rid of it. It's a really easy thing to do. And I don't know why more people don't do it. Maybe it's just because they haven't listened to my talks yet. But yeah, and it's amazing because everyone I talk to, when they've done it, I'll get people come back to my presentations and they're like, I turned off the notifications. Oh my God, I have so much more time and I'm getting so much more done. Because you've got to remember that every time that beeps or every time your little icon comes up on your email, you attend to it. Even if you don't want to, you attend to it because it captures your attention. You lose 90 seconds of what you were just doing. Yeah. So the last 90 seconds of what you were doing, you just lost. And it takes you about 2.5 minutes to get back to what you were doing.
Yeah.
Every time one of those things beeps or buzzes or does any of those things, you're losing about 3 minutes of your day. And you think about how many times that happens, like that's a shitload of your day that you're losing out of your productivity. And then everyone's like, why am I so busy? It's because you don't have time because you're constantly being distracted.
I have most of my notifications turned off. I get text messages. That's about it. But it's like a little silent it's like a silent voice that sits beside my desk. Usually what I have to do, like if I really want to focus deeply, is like walk across the other side of this place and like put it over there where I can't touch it, like get it so far away from me, and then it becomes less of an issue. But then sometimes it's like I tune into it mentally. I'm like, I wonder what's happening over there, and that's just that focus coming in and out. So I think, yeah, most definitely, like turning notifications off is absolutely the start, but I don't think it's for my own personal experience, I don't think it solves all the problems. I think that with my investigation is what's actually happening under the surface, and I think it's a little dopamine rush every single time. So what I'm currently exploring is like, how can I get a dopamine rush by not checking my phone? Because I don't want to be checking my phone. So what I've been doing recently, and particularly in preparation for this podcast, when I've been learning more about this, is I'm like, I'm going to try and trigger a dopamine rush in myself when I would have checked my phone, but I didn't. And that's like a mini milestone that I just went 20 minutes or half hour without checking my phone. I'm like, well done, Richard, little pat on the back. And it's like, oh, there's a bit of dopamine. And now I'm trying to reverse engineer the cycle of this chemical to reward myself for doing something that I want myself to do. Is there anything in this?
Yeah, no, I think that's great if you can do that. Remembering to do that is probably the difficult bit, but I think that's beautiful. And there's, yeah, if it works, let me know. We can do an experiment and see whether or not there's any neurological effects of it. But we do know just having your phone near you does attract your attention. So we know just having your phone close to you decreases your intelligence. So there's some great studies showing IQ goes down when your phone's beside you, even if it's turned off, or if it's in your pocket and it's turned off, your IQ decreases and your working memory, which is vital for learning, decreases as well when the phone's just near you and it's turned off. So yeah, you're right. You've got to really put it away if you want to do that. I always have it on the charger, which is way away from me. But you still, yeah, it's so addictive. It really is. I mean, they've done a beautiful job of capturing us all.
Well, I think the fact that Steve Jobs didn't let his children have an iPad is
Yeah.
evidence in itself that these things aren't helpful for us. So,
Yeah.
hey,
it's the Waldorf schools too. I mean, the Waldorf schools in the Silicon Valley, the private schools, very expensive. All of the tech gurus send their kids to the Waldorf schools. You've got to sign a contract to say that you won't give your child a mobile phone or any devices until they're a certain age. I think it's like 16 or 17. And they don't have any devices in these schools. And all the tech guys spend fortune to send their kids to these schools that are tech free. So, they know what's happening.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, Australia's going the opposite direction.
Yeah. We could talk for hours, Mark. So I think it's time that we start landing the ship, because I'd love to open up the floor to questions. I have a couple of things that I'd like to ask you. So if we bring it back to the classroom and on the subject of focus, I'd like to know. I'd like you to offer some advice, maybe some takeaways to any teachers or parents in here. Like, how do we create the optimal state of learning in our classroom? So there's probably two parts that I'm curious about. So one part is on the subject of focus. Like, how do we lay the foundation for our children to have the children in our care who we're trying to teach and who we want to learn? How do we lay the foundation for them to have the optimal platform for learning? So in terms of like the stimulation in the room, all the dynamic elements of a room. And when you look at an office today, like an Airbnb office or a Google office, it's clearly a lot of science put into how these offices are set up. Like if you look at the education system across the last 100 years, it's like it's row after row after row, and everyone's in a chair and everyone's facing the front. But clearly Google and Airbnb and these really big companies who are probably at the forefront of office, the structure of an office and to produce the deepest work and the best work possible, are onto something. What would your advice be to teachers who are setting up a classroom, but also parents who are setting up learning spaces in their own home, as to how they can cater for the different needs of their child, but even know what the needs of the children that they have are, so they have the best chance of their children feeling successful, productive, and focused in their learning environment?
Yeah, it's interesting. So Google is interesting. So they have lots of different spaces, and there's spaces where you do your thinking, where they are isolated and they're closed off, and they're just one person in this little box where they can actually just think. And then there's areas where they collaborate, where they can do things. There's areas where you're not allowed to take devices, which are those thinking areas. So devices aren't allowed in those areas. There's not allowed to be any things and so on. And so, yeah, we need to be, to really focus, we need to get rid of all the distractions. And nothing annoys me more than going into a classroom, especially primary school classroom where there's lots of things hanging, because every time the wind blows, they move, and they're really good at attracting your attention, right, and away from the teacher. So we've got to stop that. We don't want it to be completely bland because that's just boring, right? But we don't want too much stuff, and we especially don't want things that are move. So the 4 things that attract our attention are faces, color attracts our attention, especially reds and oranges and yellows. Movement attracts our attention, and sound attracts our attention. So those are the 4 things you want to be careful of. And it's interesting because, you know, you talked about having all the rows and looking forward. It actually is the best way to actually set up a classroom, because you don't have faces looking at you except for the teacher, and so therefore you're attracted to the teacher and not to everybody else. So it actually is the best way to have a classroom set up if you're actually learning from the teacher. So whoever you're learning from is the person you want to be facing, and not other people, because their faces are going to attract your attention. And again, you don't want much movement around, and you don't want too much colour, especially reds and oranges and yellows, which is also going to attract their attention. But you don't want it too dull. There's a great paper, actually, I did a webinar, which is on my website, with a professor in the UK who spent a lot of time actually studying schools and classrooms. And he showed that the setup of the classroom can affect a student's learning just as much as the efficacy of the teacher. So how good a teacher is affects their learning just as much as how the classroom's set up. And here's a whole bunch of stuff. So if you look at that, you can see you know, how to actually set up a classroom well. And other things that are really important, of course, is ventilation as well, because a classroom can actually get to a toxic level quite quickly if there's not good ventilation in the room. One of the best ways to get anybody to actually focus is using a technique called the Pomodoro technique. Pomodoro after tomato, because the original studies were done in Italy with these tomato timers. With an adult, it's been shown the best timing is 25 minutes. So what you do is you set the timer for 25 minutes and you just focus on the one thing for that 25 minutes, and you do nothing else but focus for the 25 minutes. And then after 25 minutes is up, you have a 5-minute break where you get up and you move. You don't do anything else, but you move, and then you sit down and you do it again. And you do that 4 times, which gives you 2 hours of focused attention on a task, and then you have a longer break. I've used that with teachers and with school psychologists, with kids with ADHD and kids with autism, where we've actually done it on much shorter periods of time. So starting with 1 minute, 2 minutes, and then slowly building up, and it works extremely well. And so if you're in younger kids, you do it for a shorter period of time. Older kids, you can do it for longer. You wouldn't do it any more than 25 minutes at a time. And that's really the best way to get someone to actually focus. And so students at home can use that Pomodoro technique when they're studying. And then in the classroom, you can set up the Pomodoro technique to actually get kids to concentrate. And again, to develop that ability to actually use their attentional mechanisms to focus on something and not get distracted by other things. And then once it's developed, they can then strengthen it by increasing the period that they're actually focusing for.
Sure, wonderful. Mark, I'm going to ask one last question. In fact, it's not really even a question, it's an opportunity for you to maybe say one last statement. And whilst you're answering that, I'm going to dart my eyes over to the chat, and hopefully the chat's on, and we'll take a couple of questions off some of our attendees. So for anyone that's in this room, thank you so much to everyone that's come along and been witness to this amazing presentation from Mark. What is the one thing, Mark, that you would recommend to a parent or a teacher that they could be doing differently, or they could be doing better, or that they should be thinking about even to enhance, to make the best chance possible that our children learn? What would be the one thing that you would say?
Reading on books. Reading books is, the one thing that I would say, but not reading books that they're required to read. Reading books that they actually enjoy reading. As I said, I learned how to read reading surfing magazines, which was fortunate that I was interested in searching, because then I learned how to read. But if I hadn't have been interested in surfing, I probably would have never learned how to read. So I would have never had the capacity to actually go back to university to get my HSC and then go to university. But reading really is crucial for all aspects of learning. And so getting kids to actually read, but read on paper, because we know that reading on paper results in better learning and better memory, better retention, and less stress, because you do get a lot of stress associated with reading on screen. So getting kids to read regularly, but getting them to read something that they're actually interested in. My son was actually never interested in reading until he was in grade 1, and he got into Pokemon, and so he wanted to be able to read the Pokemon cards so that he could play Pokemon with his friends. And that's what got him into reading. And then he started reading all Pokemon books, and now he reads novels and all the rest of it quite regularly. So you just got to find that thing that they're interested in and get them to start reading, and then have them read regularly from then on. And they can be whatever they want to be after that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Mark. Now I'm just communicating with, oh, here we go. Communicating with Jake, who's up in Mullumbimby, and he's trying to enable the chat for us. Here he is. He's just stuck his hand up. Got him. Okay, make a presenter, and Jake's the whiz on Teams here. So everyone, the chat will hopefully be enabled in just a moment. I think Jake's now going to be able to turn that on, because I don't know how to. My technology skills aren't that advanced in this particular platform. But please get some questions ready, fire them away, and we'll answer some of these questions. Mark, is there anything, just while Jake's turning the chat on, and hopefully a few questions will come in? Jake's got the chat on, so here we go. So we've got a question here. So Carly McLucky, I think it is. What are your thoughts on online schooling?
It needs to be done well. I think the best way to do homeschooling or schooling or remote schooling is to give the students what they actually need and allow them to read that and do that offline, and then have short periods of time where they're actually online. I think having a situation where they're online for long periods of time actually increases stress and anxiety, and isn't actually good for learning. So we know if you give a student, well, anybody, a PDF, a paper copy of a PDF versus the same PDF on a screen, and they read it, and then you test them, the performance is better. They learn more from the paper version than they do from the screen version. There's multiple reasons for that. But it does show that we need to actually be learning from paper, not from a screen. And so having them print the stuff out or having it accessible to them, which is what's done with homeschooling and so on, works quite well. And then having short periods of time where they're actually online with the teacher, and they can ask questions and they can get feedback and so on. So it needs to be done well, and we need to not be spending huge amounts of time online, but rather doing it on paper in the real world.
Great. Tasneem asked the question. She said she wants some advice on memory and memorization for content that might not be as engaging for students. How do we increase memory? How do we boost our capacity to remember things?
Yeah, great question. So the best way to do it is to write notes. Actually, the best way to do it is to draw. So number one is to draw. I'm a shocking drawer, so I don't draw, I write notes. But writing notes is just behind drawing. Typing actually isn't good for memory. So if you actually type, you don't actually get as better memory trace as if you actually write. And the reason for that is that when you write, you form different motor commands for each letter, whereas when you're typing, it's the same motor commands because all the letters are all the same. You're just hitting keys rather than actually writing. So you get better formation. Plus, teaching the students how to write notes well. I used to always joke about my first year students when they came in, there'd be 1,000 of them in the lecture theatre, but I could always tell the ones who get high distinctions because they'd walk in with notepads and a whole bunch of stationery. and they were really good with all their stationery because they'd write really good notes and they'd have, you know, little love hearts and they'd have stickers here and all the rest of it. And all those things are what we call links and anchors associated with your notes. And they actually result in better learning because you've got all that stuff to add to your memory formation, to all those links in your memory and the consolidation of the stuff. So teaching them how to actually write really good notes is really important, and you actually get much better memory retention for that. And then the third one is because you forget so quickly and it's a forgetting curve, you've got to constantly be quizzing on the information that you want them to remember every day or two. Have some short quiz, but again, not in a way that you give them the stuff and then you give them the answer, you know, because most of the time they won't go through the ones they got wrong anyway. You do it live, you do it in front of them, and you do it straight away, and you do it quick, and you get it over and done with. And it can last, you know, a couple of minutes. You get through a whole bunch of quick questions and then move on, and that'll actually increase their memory formation because they'll quickly think of the answer, and if they can't think of the answer, then they will have got it wrong, and yeah, they'll remember it better next time.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark. Megha asked a question: how do we strike the balance between using online tools for teaching and you know, keeping children away from the screen? So, you know, the balance of you know, online and offline learning, so to speak, in the classroom, no doubt, I think she's referring to. You know, because there's so many apps, and I mean, we run an online education platform there. To some extent, looking at screens for some of the day when if children are participating in our learning.
Yes, yeah. You've got to try and reset them. So when they're on the screen, we know that stress is increased. So there's lots of studies showing that you get increase in cortisol when students are on a screen, are using a screen. So stress levels are increasing when they're actually on a screen. So what you want to do is when they're on the screen for a period of time, then get them up and get them to move so that you reset that stress level. Because the best way to reset a stress level is just get them to move in some way, whether you get them to do, you know, push-ups or squats or run around the room or just get up and go out and get a drink and come back in or whatever. Get them up to move, and when they come back, they'll then be settled again, and so they can then concentrate on whatever you want them to do. But, you know, number one would be when they are doing stuff on a screen, they have a notepad beside them and they actually start writing notes about whatever they're learning, because the writing the notes will actually result in learning. Whereas when they're actually just watching something on a screen, they don't actually take the information in as well as if they're actually writing. So get them to write notes while they're on the screen, if you do have to be on a screen.
Amazing, cool. Rachel Saliba, hello. Rachel asks, how do you think children's learning can improve if parents are more aware of how their children learn and how the brain learns, and how to support children to exercise the brain and develop their cognitive skills?
Yeah, it's learning, children and teens learning, I think, needs to be a partnership between the school and the parents. So having the parents understand neuroscience of learning, and whenever I present at a school, I always, you know, present to the community as well on the neuroscience of learning, so that the whole community is aware of where we're going with the school and what we're working on, and so it can be instigated both at home and in the classroom, because I think it does have to be a whole community event, and everybody needs to be on board with it. Otherwise, you're not going to get great learning. I mean, there are situations where that can't happen because of, you know, some of the schools, as I said, I work with, there are a lot of other issues and big, you know, major issues at homes and with gangs and so on. So those situations sometimes don't work, but ideally, yeah, we want everybody on the same page so that we can work on that at home and in the classroom.
As the old proverb goes, it takes a village to raise a child.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I think that we miss that these days. I think we need more of that.
I think so too. It all comes back to point number one, human connection, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's number one, always. Yeah. I mean, there are 5 keys to learning, and number one is a connection, and connection affects the other 4. And the other 4 are attention, error feedback, consolidation, and engagement. But none of those are going to happen if you don't have connection.
Hey, Mark, I don't want to open up another can of worms, but there was one really big question that was on my list that wanted to ask you, and we chatted briefly about it offline. So maybe in a minute or two, maybe you could tell us about the science of giving and the importance of giving in relation to learning. This is a really, really interesting one for me.
Yeah. So,
And are we opening up a are we opening up a deep dive into something that's going to keep everyone up for another 20 minutes, or can we do this in a minute or two?
I'll try to do it in a minute or two. I'll try to do it quick. So,
and then we'll close down and thank you, Mark. I promise you.
Okay. From an evolutionary point of view, we're in these tribes, we're in these groups, and we wanted to actually connect with each other. How we did that was, of course, giving, right? We would actually, one person or a group of people would go out and hunt, and another group of people would go and look for other tubers and all the rest of it, and then they come back and they share that stuff with each other, and that was giving to each other. And you do that when you're in a group, you do that when you're in a family, and it's a way of actually connecting with each other. And that's where giving actually comes from, and that's why it's so embedded in our brains. It's part of our socialization, and we are social animals, and most of our brain is dedicated to being social. And a big part of being social is giving to each other, is actually enabling each other to survive through giving. And then we've sort of evolved that into other sorts of gifts and so on. But giving is so important for us as human beings to feel connected to the group. And giving over a wider area, such as what you guys are doing, which is beautiful, where you build libraries for another school in another community. It just widens that community. It widens who's part of your in-group to this new community and this new, and so it expands your brain and expands what you see as your community and what you see as being part of it. But yeah, that's giving is really part of who we are, because that's how we've evolved, right? We've evolved to be in groups, and the way you interact in groups is to give to each other.
Giving is the gift that keeps on giving.
Absolutely. And results in more benefit to the giver than the giver. No, to the giver. The receiver doesn't get as many benefits as the person who actually gives. The person who gives, from a neuroscience point of view, gets a huge amount of neurotransmitters released and all these other things. So the person actually giving the gift actually benefits hugely from that.
Yeah, the release of oxytocin, is it? When we give and then we witness giving, it releases this beautiful chemical into our body.
Yeah.
Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Now you've got a website here I'm looking at, drmarkwilliams.com. How can we get in contact with you? Anyone that's listening to this, you run sessions in schools, you advise, you teach leadership, you do a bunch of stuff, all backed by science, which I think is the coolest part, like evidence-based approaches to improving learning and improving leadership. Do you want to tell us how we can get in touch with you and some of the things that might be of interest to our audience?
Yeah, if you email me at drmarkwilliams.com, or head off over to my website, which is www.drmarkwilliams.com. There's a whole bunch of stuff on that website. There's links to the podcasts and other stuff on there. So have a look. And there's also, you can sign up to the newsletter as well on that website, which is a monthly newsletter that I send out, which has free things like this on it, and a lot of bunch of other things and tips of the month and so on. So yeah, get in touch if you want to chat about anything.
And you come into schools and you do sort of consulting work, is that right?
Yeah, so I do professional development, both with schools, with the teachers, and with counsellors, school counsellors and school psychologists. I have a double degree in psychology and physiology, and I've worked in psychology departments as well as physiology. So I do both of those things, and we can work around neuroscience of learning, devices in schools and how to do it better, and neuroscience of emotions and how to connect. So those are the three big things I focus on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mark. Please reach out to Mark if this is of interest. I think we can never underestimate the power of a specialist. Like obviously Mark's specialty is neuroscience, but he also specializes in education and neuroscience. So I think that that's a really powerful thing for teachers or principals or anyone looking at this this video now or down the track. Reach out to Mark, because his work is amazing. He's widely published, international presenter on a lot of mainstream media outlets. So Mark really does know what he's talking about. So Mark, thank you so much for sharing everything tonight. It's been a joy. I literally could talk to you for another 3 hours and I'd still have more questions. I've got a lot of notes here. I didn't get to all the questions, so maybe we'll save that for next time.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to come back, and thanks for having me, Rich.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to everyone that's joined us this evening. For everyone that's in Australia, it's just about to tick over to 9:30, so hopefully the kids are in bed and it's a cup of tea, devices down, read a book, and go to bed. Is that right, Mark? Get your 8 hours sleep.
Read a book, yes, absolutely.
Read a book. I'm very surprised that reading the book is the number one recommendation from a neuroscientist, and it just reaffirms that quite often the simple things are the best things in life, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Always are, right? Cup of tea, a good book, or time with loved ones. Hey.
Well, I'm going to be doing that, and I haven't picked up a book in a while, but you've absolutely got me engaged in reinvestigating my love of reading, or re-engaging with my love of reading.
Awesome.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everyone. We're going to leave the chat. This recording will be published on the Upschool website. There's a tab at the top called Learn, and down there underneath there's live event replays. That's where you'll find this if you want to revisit it. We've got schools in there. Please share it with your school community. Send it home, and please reach out to Mark if you'd like to engage more in his work. Thank you so much, Mark. Talk soon, everyone.
Thank you, Rich.
See you later. Thanks.
It's Richard Mills from Upschool here. For more amazing free lessons like this one, create a free account at upschool.co, and we can't wait to see you on our platform.